Imagine swimming upstream against a powerful current. If your objective is to get upriver, do you keep fighting an overwhelming force that dwarfs you as an individual, or do you use that little neocortex of yours to find the path of least resistance? Maybe you swim to the riverbank, get out, and nonchalantly walk to your destination using those God-given chicken legs of yours. Wasn't that easy? The reason I'm writing this essay is that if you live in the United States like me, the phenomena I'll be discussing today have everything to do with you. How you make your living is based on the US dollar. The begging for a pagan t-shirt you're getting for your friend's white elephant Christmas gift exchange, you're also going to need US dollars for it. If you're a recent high school graduate, the debt you take on today for student loans will be denominated in dollars. The dollar is at the core of your existence whether you realize it or not, and market forces larger than you, just like that river current, are always flowing whether you're conscious of it or not. Gen Z and Gen Alpha face a dangerous lack of awareness about four compounding forces that threaten to intensify social instability and violent infighting in the decades ahead. These forces include the steady devaluation of the US dollar driven by unsustainable debt expansion, the fracturing of global supply chains through deglobalization, the erosion of shared moral structures due to secularization, and the overproduction of elite aspirants seeking concentrated social power, all of which were largely created and distorted by older generations. Divisiveness and tribalism are already the unfortunate norm. This awareness gap is not the fault of younger generations. Most are navigating a macroeconomic environment that schools and institutions rarely explained during their formative years. Fortunately, the internet now makes this knowledge widely accessible. This essay is my attempt, as a 28-year-old living in Southern California, to provide an objective, nonpartisan overview of these far-reaching, convoluted, and overlooked issues. Few people seem eager to fully grasp their scope, let alone address them. At the end, I offer some unfiltered, realistic solutions you can begin implementing in your own life. Let's begin. Bretton Woods and Triffin's dilemma. If asked to name two major global events of 1944 besides World War II, few would immediately mention the Bretton Woods Conference. Yet while carnage engulfed Europe and the Pacific, delegates from 44 allied nations gathered in the small town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. After 22 days of negotiations, they formally established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. This agreement laid the foundation for the post-war international monetary system, the framework that determines which currency countries use to buy goods and services from one another. The primary purposes of a global reserve currency are efficiency and stability. Consider Germany, whose domestic currency is the euro. To purchase goods and services from 20 countries that each use a different currency, Germany would need to convert euros into each of those 20 currencies and maintain reserves in a basket of 21 currencies. This arrangement would create unnecessary risk and complexity. A global reserve currency resolves the issue. Germany needs to hold only two currencies, the euro for domestic transactions and the US dollar for international trade. Another part of the Bretton Woods Agreement, which, if you weren't familiar with Bretton Woods before today, you may recognize this portion of it, was the US dollar being pegged to gold. All right. Hold your horses, cowboy. I mean, pegged as in an ounce of gold was equivalent to 35 greenbacks. You skull-sucking son of a bitch. To us peasants, this sounds euphoric, almost divine, one might say. A world where my money is attached to something of tangible value, the most fucking valuable thing in the world. Gold, sweet, sweet gold. More like sweet baby Jesus, or even sweet baby Ray's. Sadly, this tale's borderline reminiscent of the ruthlessness of God in the Old Testament because, too fucking bad, pussy. You were born too late for this era. Your dollar is worth dick. Okay, maybe not dick per se, more like dick adjacent or dick curious. Speaking of Dick Nixon, more commonly known as Richard Nixon, the 37th president of the United States, was the man in office when the US dollar was officially depegged from gold, because all good things must come to an end. But why? Why? In essence, as the economy boomed, so did the need for US dollars. Thanks to Bretton Woods, which, may I say, is a solid porn star name, gold was now acting as an anchor, a viciously cock-blocking third wheel to a world flourishing in international trade. But then suddenly, in the corner of your eye, your wingman appears. Dick fucking Nixon comes to your rescue in the hour of your greatest need and tells everyone, I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the American dollar, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interests of the United States. A loss of confidence was occurring abroad. The British wanted their gold back. The French wanted their gold back. Before we knew it, our gold vaults were getting a train ran on them. And I ain't talking about you, Thomas. These outflows of gold and the U.S. government spending more than it was taking in from tax revenue were effectively eroding trust in the system. And without trust, no currency can survive. With the dog in the U.S. dollar let loose, a new dilemma comes into play. To finance the U.S. government's fiscal deficits, once again, spending more than it collects in tax revenue, the U.S. Treasury proceeds to issue debt in the form of Treasury securities, bills, notes, and bonds. Foreign entities buy U.S. Treasury securities because they're liquid, meaning they're easy to sell for cash, and dollar denominated, you get repaid for them in U.S. dollars. Tying this in with the fact that the U.S. dollar is, to this day, the global reserve currency essential for international trade, there is a literal global demand for U.S. debt. The dollar is a lubricant in the global economic system. Sure, too much lubricant gets all over the place. Hubba hubba. But too little, and the trade relations you're trying to execute are caught in a stir. Too few dollars in the system mean more expensive dollars, and more expensive dollars mean less global trade. Wait. What the fuck do you mean by an expensive dollar? That shit doesn't make any sense, you doink. Okay, think of diamonds. Yes, those diamonds you cucks cherish as a symbolic object for the love you hold with your partner. If tomorrow a cargo ship washes ashore with enough diamonds to make enough engagement rings and mining drill bits for the next century, do you think the prices of engagement rings will go up or down in response to this gargantuan supply? It's going down. So much so that the value of an engagement ring will lose all its pizzazz. Sorry, huz. Dollars are the same. Lots of dollars in the system, and conducting trade is cheap and easy. With too few dollars, countries like Germany will need to scrounge more euros than they normally would for imports. To assure the world of an ample supply of dollars, selling U.S. debt isn't the only weapon the United States has at its disposal. Since our currency is oh so blessed to be the global reserve currency, maintaining trade deficits, which means we import more goods and services in dollars than we export, provides other countries with dollars through our trade with them. This double teaming by the United States is how the dollar maintains its position as the world's global reserve currency. The problem is that, in the name of economic growth and expansion, ever more debt must be created, along with ever larger U.S. trade deficits. Dollar devaluation is an intrinsic side effect by the artificial rules of this monetary system. The economic world of tomorrow is supposed to be larger than today's, so you'll need more dollars to make that expansion thrive. Dollars are to global trade what breathable air is to humans. More of it allows for growth and sustainment, while less of it, and you're cooked. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with me buying another Soarin', or going to Stagecoach, or Coachella, or seeing the Marias at the Kia Forum, or scoring Labubus, or Birkenstocks, or my favorite mid-matcha drink, or whatever the fuck you people are buying these days? The dollars you earn from labor, working a job, will perpetually lose value under this system. And as long as the dollar remains the dominant global reserve currency, that's exactly how it's going to stay. Now, I'm not saying we should go full Tyler Durden here, shave our heads, and launch Project Mayhem. His name is Robert Paulson. His name is Robert Paulson. His name is Robert Paulson. Don't do that. But just like being a recovering alcoholic, the first step is realizing there's a problem. And right now, it's clearly everyone else and not you. Before we can get to any real implementable solutions for preserving your wealth, we still have more problems to touch upon. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's an AGM-158 Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff missile. I'm writing this on April 30th, 2026. Operation Epic Fury, a United States-led military campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran that began 61 days ago on February 28th, has now entered a tumultuous pause. So far, the operation has featured hundreds of U.S. and Israeli combat aircraft, including Lockheed's fifth-generation F-35 multi-role stealth fighter jet. Say that 5 times fast. The 30mm Gatling gun root to shoot an A-10 Thunderbolt attack aircraft, and the big Wapenchungus B-1 Lancer heavy bomber. A portion of these birds launch from multi-billion-dollar nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Those mean floating skyscrapers holding hands with guided missile destroyers and submarines that'll lob RTX's precision-guided flying wieners filled with 265 pounds of high-explosive condiment to your kitchen as long as it's within 900 nautical miles. Not even Joey Chestnut himself could eat all of those dogs. Not only are we watching the most expensive and technologically advanced killing machines humanity has ever engineered get put through their paces in real combat, but the carpet does match the drapes here too. The weapons these aircraft and ships are expending are just as pricey and cutting edge. The RTX Tomahawk missile I called a wiener earlier retails for about $3 million a piece and takes 18 to 24 months to manufacture. According to an article from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, 850 Tomahawks were fired in the first 27 days of the operation. That's roughly $2.5 billion worth of catching a fade. Worse yet, the Navy only expects to receive about 190 new Tomahawks by the end of 2026. That's about 22% of the ones already used. So who cares if the US Navy doesn't get new Tomahawk missiles, you warmongering cunt? Whoa, take it easy, mommy. Your tax dollars fund the same war machine as mine. Cunt calling aside, boyo, there is a significance here we need to highlight. Whether you're a pacifist, indifferent, or supporter of the current operation in the Middle East. These lethal modern marvels of research and material science are among the extraordinarily few examples we have of what the world looked like before globalization, a process in which the world's economies, industries, and countries became increasingly interdependent. Everything from iPhones, cars and trucks, commercial airliners, fertilizer for the global food supply, coffee, computers, and even that Caltech computer science major's Nike running shoes that have never seen anything beyond a brisk walking pace depends on the global supply chains. Apple's iPhone, for example, starts its life in California. Capital-intensive research and development led to the final design of the hardware, software, semiconductor chip architecture, and ultimately the marketing strategies that'll sell these iPhones like hotcakes to us affirm payment plan dependent chodes. The physical manufacturing of the components required to produce a functioning assembly occurs elsewhere. Still, before that, raw materials such as cobalt and lithium must first be extracted by miners in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Lithium and copper are sourced from Chilean deserts. Aluminum and rare earth elements are dug out in Australia and China. Oh, and don't think these materials are found in their immediately usable form straight out of the ground either. Good old widely used aluminum, for example, must undergo an immensely resource-intensive process, starting with converting a clay-like ore called bauxite into alumina, then smelting it by adding a chemical reducing agent at nearly 1000 degrees Celsius. Each of the modern materials we rely on depends on an extensive mining and refinement supply chain of its own. Industries that hinge on immense amounts of energy inputs ranging from hydropower, coal, or natural gas that, you guessed it, also have their own supply chain. Okay. Sorry for the detour. Let's return to the nitty-gritty of the iPhone's manufacturing process. The semiconductor manufacturing company, TSMC, which is based in Taiwan, uses $380 million lithography machines designed and built by Dutch-based ASML to produce the semiconductors. On God, I'm not trying to get excessively sidetracked once again. Still, the complexity of the supply chains associated with semiconductor producing lithography machines alone is another teeny tiny contributing puzzle piece in the web of modern day globalization. One of these bad boys weighs 165,000 kilograms, which is comparable to the weight of two Airbus A320 commercial airliners. Installing one of these bad boys requires about 250 shipping containers and 250 engineers working for 6 months. Massive W for the sweet 2 nanometer chip Fab Labs aura. Shit. Okay, so we're circling back again to the iPhone. Samsung and LG, based in South Korea, supply the OLED displays. Sony in Japan provides the cameras, and Bosch in Germany fabricates the sensors. According to Apple, its supply chains depend on thousands of supply facilities in more than 60 countries. Almost one third of the world's countries are responsible for the manufacturing process of the iPhone, and it's just one product in a world of a fucking lot of products. This is globalization in a nutshell. You can design a product, and the world's supply chains are at your fingertips, given you have the capital and intellectual property to get it done. Modern day shipping containers like the Maersk Triple E, capable of carrying as many as 18,000 containers, make this all possible. For now. The weaponry I mentioned earlier exemplifies the exact opposite of globalization's characteristics. Instead of efficiency through outsourcing, security and control are the priority. American military contracts have strict ITAR standards, meaning the manufacturing, importing, and exporting of military technology and intellectual property are tightly controlled. Security against intellectual property theft is prioritized over cutting costs or lead times, resulting in most supply chains being US based. Each Tomahawk, for example, like an iPhone, involves thousands of precision engineered parts with absurdly minute tolerances that must survive for years in storage, withstand the immense forces experienced during missile launch, and maintain an X-Acto blade level of accuracy on target after flying hundreds of miles. So what's the point here, boyo? Apple shipped about 240 million iPhones in 2025. 240 million. If you were to count at 240 million, one number per second without stopping to eat, sleep, or goon, it would take you approximately 7.6 years. Apple produced that many iPhones, each with thousands of parts from suppliers spanning the globe, in just a single year, all while RTX is expecting to produce only about 190 Tomahawks by the end of 2026. Now, I know, comparing apples to oranges ain't entirely fair, or I suppose apples to Tomahawks in this example. The real question we should be asking is, well, what happens if globalization ceases to exist, where production lines resemble more of a Tomahawk missile than an iPhone? Before we wargame what a world with less interdependent supply chains could look like, just like with understanding the US dollar in the present, we must understand the context in which it was created. After World War II, the United States needed a coalition of allies that could help contain the Soviet Union, and if necessary, to fight it if the Cold War turned hot. We're all familiar with NATO, founded in 1949 explicitly as a military coalition to counter the Soviet Union. Less well known is the global superpower-backed economic stimulus that the United States extended to its allies. After all, if you're going to build a coalition of nations capable of resisting and beating the Soviets, they also need to be economic and industrial regional powers capable of supporting their own militaries. Leveraging its massive post-war naval dominance, the United States guaranteed that its allies could, in the words of Peter Zeihan, go anywhere, anytime, interface with anyone, in any economic matter, participate in any supply chain, and access any material input, all without needing a military escort. Herein lies the birth of modern artificial free trade. The world didn't always work like this, even if we assumed it did. Unlike today, where the world's nations have agreed to rules on maritime trade security and the United States serves as a dominant military presence enforcing those rules globally, trade route security was historically treated as a zero-sum game. Each nation was responsible for the security of its own goods. Britain cared only about British ships, the Dutch about Dutch ships, and so forth. Building and sustaining an effective military is an immense resource drain. The U.S. military budget for 2025 was $852 billion and slightly over $1 trillion for 2026, which is why the closest historical examples of the modern-day U.S. playing the role of Team America World Police were mercantilist empires such as the British, Spanish, and even the Dutch East India Trading Company. These powers maintain global military forces explicitly to protect and control high-value trade routes. In his book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Zeihan spotlights how the snowballing of globalization brought unfathomable technological progress, and with it, mass production and mass consumption not seen on Earth before, all happening simultaneously. This positive feedback loop on steroids, TRT, trend, peptides, and stem cells set the stage for the world's population to rage higher. At the conclusion of World War II, the world's population was merely 2.3 billion. As of 2026, 81 years after the end of World War II, the population has screamed to about 8.3 billion people. The United States funded strategy to counter the Soviet Union led to an additional 6 billion people being born. Once the Iron Curtain fell along with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, even more countries joined globalization, supercharging it even further with the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995, new regional trade agreements such as NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, and China's ascension into the WTO in 2001, after which it became the world's manufacturing base and the United States' biggest economic competitor. Before we digress to the next chapter, here's a brief recap of what we've covered so far. Number 1. The United States must continue to take on increasing amounts of debt, along with ever larger trade deficits to sustain an ample supply of US dollars in the global economy. This stems from the dollar's role as a global reserve currency established at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. The dollar's job is to remain cheap and abundant so other countries can conduct trade with one another. Number 2. The U.S. military, requiring a constant massive inflow of resources simply for sustainment, and even more for the never-ending modernization needed to maintain its position as a dominant global force, provided allied nations with the security necessary for globalization to flourish. Today, any country can do business with any other country without worrying about threats to its trade routes. At the same time, the United States continues to bear the full cost of providing this global security umbrella on its own. Number 3. As globalization progressed and the US dollar was depegged from gold, demand for dollars went into overdrive. More trade simply meant more dollars were needed. Globalization left on red. The ideas examined in this essay have developed over several decades. However, recent events have provided vivid confirmation of globalization's inherent fragility. The transition of Operation Epic Fury from initial kinetic strikes involving jets, missiles, and explosives to a sustained campaign of sanctions and naval blockades illustrates how rapidly the post-World War II trading system can unravel when the security of critical maritime choke points is undermined. Approximately 20% of global crude oil and significant volumes of liquefied natural gas transit the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most vital strategic choke points. This narrow waterway between Iran and Oman serves as a primary export route for oil and LNG from major Persian Gulf producers, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iran, and Qatar. Roughly 80 to 89% of these energy exports are destined for Asian markets, particularly China, India, Japan, and South Korea. Japan and South Korea are especially dependent on the region, sourcing between 72 to 93% and 68 to 81% of their crude oil imports, respectively, from the Middle East. The strait also carries other essential commodities, such as fertilizers critical to global food production, sulfur used in batteries and phosphate fertilizers, helium essential for semiconductors and medical imaging, and aluminum. Major importers of fertilizers reliant on Hormuz transit include India, Brazil, Australia, Thailand, and the United States. In a highly interdependent global economy, disruptions at this choke point have far-reaching, long-lasting consequences across multiple industries. These supply shocks were compounded by strikes from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps against critical energy infrastructure in several Gulf states. Qatar, which accounts for roughly 3 to 4% of global LNG production, was forced to suspend approximately 17% of its export capacity due to extensive damage, with repairs projected to require 3 to 5 years. The strategic logic behind accepting these substantial costs became clearer when viewed in light of the January 2026 U.S. operation that resulted in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. Before the raid, the Trump administration had positioned substantial forces under Operation Southern Spear, including the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group, the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, and Special Operations Elements, totaling approximately 10,000 to 15,000 personnel in the Southcom Theater. The administration justified the action primarily on the grounds that Maduro led the Cartel de los Soles, a narcotics trafficking network embedded within the Venezuelan government. Public messaging placed relatively little emphasis on Venezuela's deepening strategic partnerships with Russia, formalized in a major 10-year treaty in May 2025, and China, elevated to an all-weather strategic partnership status in September 2023. In the aftermath, Venezuela's new government released hundreds of political prisoners, enacted an amnesty bill, and moved swiftly to normalize relations with Washington. By March 2026, full diplomatic and consular ties had been restored after a 7-year hiatus. The U.S. Embassy in Caracas had reopened. The sanctions on the oil and mining sectors were significantly eased. This shift enabled a pragmatic, transactional relationship focused on reviving energy production and attracting foreign investment. Iran occupies a parallel position within great power competition. Like Venezuela, it maintains close strategic ties with both Russia and China. Relationships strengthened by shared opposition to U.S. sanctions, military technical cooperation, energy linkages, and alignment in forums such as BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These partnerships, while not formal mutual defense alliances, have deepened considerably since the 2025 12-day war between Israel and Iran. The pattern aligns with the analysis in Edward Fishman's book Choke Points, which traces the expansion of U.S. economic statecraft against these three states beginning in 2006 with Iran's nuclear program and 2014 with Russia's actions in Crimea and the Donbass, and finally in 2018 with China's Huawei 5G infrastructure. The U.S. decision to engage Iran kinetically, despite the immediate economic burden, appears driven by a desire to dismantle and access a revisionist powers before they can coordinate more effectively. Unlike Russia and China, both nuclear-armed states whose direct confrontation would risk catastrophic escalation or severe global economic disruption, Iran lacks nuclear weapons. Neutralizing Iran as a potential partner for Moscow and Beijing reduces the probability of simultaneous multi-theater challenges. This strategy seeks to avert a worst-case convergence, a Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan, which imports 70% of its caloric food supply and produces hundreds of billions of dollars in advanced semiconductors annually via TSMC, simultaneous closure of the Strait of Hormuz by Iranian forces, Russian escalation in Ukraine, potentially involving dirty bombs and a European refugee crisis, and Venezuelan adventurism in Guyana over the Stabroek Block oil fields. By removing Iran and Venezuela from the equation, the United States can more effectively manage competition with the remaining two adversaries, rather than confronting four simultaneously. This essay does not advocate specific foreign policy positions, nor does it assess the morality of actions such as the Maduro raid or strikes on Iran. Instead, it seeks an objective understanding of the strategic rationale guiding recent U.S. decisions. Much as one might analyze the Biden administration's technology export controls on China, or the Obama administration's negotiations over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the JCPOA. Such analysis is essential for gauging the future trajectory of the international system. Ultimately, the United States faces a fundamental dilemma. While the dollar's role as a global reserve currency and the expansion of globalization have driven unprecedented worldwide economic progress, population growth, and rising living standards, recent U.S. foreign policy actions signal a significant pivot in American strategic priorities. One manifestation of this pivot could be a strategic reorientation, in which U.S. military resources focus on protecting trade routes aligned with American self-interest rather than providing a universal security umbrella, thereby reallocating defense spending toward reshoring critical industries essential to national security and high-value supply chains. These include semiconductor manufacturing, rare earth processing and permanent magnet production, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and shipbuilding, an industry in which the United States currently accounts for less than 0.1% of global gross tonnage, while Japan, China, and South Korea together produce 94 to 95%. Encouraging developments are already underway. TSMC has committed more than $65 billion to semiconductor fabrication sites in Arizona. Intel is expanding facilities in Arizona and Ohio. MP Materials is investing $1 billion in domestic rare earth mining, refining, and magnet production. And Eli Lilly has announced a $6 billion facility in Huntsville, Alabama, for active pharmaceutical ingredients. Complementary growth in nuclear energy, aerospace, and defense startups further signals progress toward greater supply chain resilience. This momentum is reinforced by the Office of Strategic Capital, the OSC, established in December 2022 by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. The OSC seeks to attract and scale private capital into U.S. companies developing technologies and supply chains critical to national security, an initiative that has transcended administrations. On August 10, 2025, the OSC issued its inaugural direct loan of $150 million to MP Materials as part of a broader Department of Defense agreement to expand domestic heavy rare earth separation capabilities. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed by President Trump on July 4, 2025, further bolstered the OSC by allocating roughly $1.5 billion in credit subsidy funding, unlocking up to $200 billion in total lending capacity over several years. Of this amount, $500 million supports up to $100 billion in loans for critical minerals and related projects, while another $1 billion targets advanced technologies, including semiconductors and quantum computing, along with additional provisions for shipbuilding and industrial base resilience. However, this strategic reorientation is not without risk. A critical consequence of the United States' withdrawal as a global security hegemon would be accelerated deglobalization. The post-World War II and post-Cold War global trading system was constructed around an American-provided security umbrella that ensured safe passage for maritime commerce. In the power vacuum that would follow a U.S. withdrawal, the deterrent against maritime piracy would erode sharply. Nations would no longer face credible threats of reprisal, such as naval intervention by a U.S. aircraft carrier strike group, for intercepting and plundering commercial vessels carrying agricultural products or refined petroleum, thereby risking the unraveling of global supply chains. Why might countries without a historical propensity for maritime raiding suddenly pursue such behavior, you say? Rational state actors would weigh potential gains against the risks of retaliation, including military strikes by affected importers, reciprocal maritime raids, or multilateral economic sanctions imposed by coalitions of trading partners. However, the cost-benefit calculus shifts dramatically in favor of highly self-sufficient nations, which can better withstand such countermeasures. Countries such as the United States, Russia, Australia, Brazil, Canada, and Argentina, each characterized by relative independence in food production, energy supply, and manufacturing, would face comparatively low domestic costs from retaliation. For these states, maritime piracy could emerge as a viable and lucrative option. By contrast, countries heavily reliant on maritime trade, yet possessing limited naval capabilities, would be particularly vulnerable. Prime targets would include Ireland, Iceland, and New Zealand, developed economies that depend extensively on sea lanes for imports and exports while maintaining only modest naval forces. Highly trade-dependent landlocked countries such as Switzerland and Luxembourg would also face considerable indirect exposure, as virtually all of their commerce passes through foreign seaports. Vessels bound for these markets typically carry high-value containerized manufactured goods, owing to their high GDP per capita. The seizure of a modern container ship could therefore generate substantial profits, as could the capture of tankers carrying crude or refined petroleum, and dry bulk carriers transporting iron ore, coal, or grain. Moreover, the captured vessel itself would represent a valuable asset, often worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, that could expand the aggressor's own maritime tonnage capacity. Another reality we cannot afford to overlook is the persistent prevalence of armed conflict around the globe. While the Russo-Ukrainian War, the conflicts between Israel and Iran's proxies, and the 2026 Iran War may dominate headlines, numerous others receive far less attention. The Sudanese Civil War, the Myanmar Civil War, the Congolese conflicts, the Somali Civil War, Islamist insurgencies in the Sahel and Maghreb, and the Mexican drug war are all active today, each producing more than 10,000 combat deaths annually. As of May 2026, 20 armed conflicts worldwide meet the threshold of at least 1,000 combat deaths per year. Formal state and non-state actors already engaged in these conflicts would now be empowered to expand their strategies by targeting their adversaries' maritime commerce, inflicting economic harm without fear of decisive U.S. retaliation. Beyond the direct losses to exporters, who receive no payment, and importers, who receive no goods, the systemic effects of widespread piracy would extend far deeper in an interdependent global economy. Although the seizure of individual vessels may initially appear manageable, repeated disruptions to critical shipments could trigger cascading failures across supply chains. Agriculture, in particular, has become deeply integrated into globalized networks. Modern farming depends on imported fertilizers to enrich soil nutrients, heavy machinery and spare parts for large-scale operations, crop protection chemicals to combat weeds, insects, diseases, and fungi, and reliable energy sources for irrigation, processing, and transportation. Piracy targeting dry bulk carriers would directly threaten imports of staple grains such as corn, soybeans, and wheat, thereby undermining livestock feed supplies and reducing meat production. Disruptions to energy shipments could curtail fuel for farm equipment, freight transport, and processing facilities, while seizures of container ships might delay essential replacement parts for machinery and logistics networks. In a world that has grown to support a population of 8.3 billion through globalization, the erosion of agricultural supply chains risks triggering massive food insecurity. Insufficient crop yields, livestock shortfalls, and breakdowns in transportation and processing could culminate in famines that exceed those of the 20th century in both scope and severity. Governments confronting domestic instability from such shortages might even be driven to tolerate or participate in piracy themselves, further entrenching a vicious cycle of deglobalization. While food insecurity represents one of the most severe consequences of deglobalization, it is not the only significant challenge. The erosion of global supply chains would also undermine the mass affordability of non-essential consumer goods, such as flat-screen televisions, smartphones, and fast fashion, that many have come to regard as ordinary features of modern life. Humanity is currently experiencing an era of unprecedented material abundance, a level of prosperity unimaginable to any previous generation in history. Nevertheless, the urgent need to strengthen the resilience of global food supply chains stands as the defining test for 21st century generations. How societies respond could mark either humanity's finest hour, through coordinated efforts to safeguard food security for a global population of 8.3 billion, or a profoundly regrettable chapter characterized by widespread suffering, societal instability, and deep collective remorse. This tension is particularly acute for the United States, despite the Trump administration's aggressive foreign policy actions, including the Maduro raid, combat operations against Iran, and the broad imposition of tariffs. The central question remains, what do these deglobalizing measures ultimately mean for the US dollar's status as a global reserve currency?